Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a returning good brother to the temple, coming to us from Media Stream Press and yet another Florida man in my hallowed halls, the one and only Andrew Frinkle, working on Terra Incognita. How you doing today, man?
Good, good. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for coming on. I had you on about last August for the Demon Age, and now I've got you back for Terra Incognita.
Yeah, Demon Age was great. It was a fun ride.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big book too, but I think I've outdone myself this time with an even larger book, or in this case, a set of three books, because it had to be broken apart.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for that. I can't go into details, but there's one project that I'm looking over where it's very clear they shouldn't have tried to scrunch everything into one book. I know it's tempting to do that because of the people's idea of, oh, you're just splitting the three so you can rack up the price. No, in some case you need to split it up. Um, I've talked in the past about Mongoose Traveler's second edition should have had its core book in three books instead of one for
Hmm.
this exact reason. But
I mean, a lot of it. I mean, I agree. Sometimes it's. I mean, there's a reason why Wizards of the Coast, even why they are going to split their stuff up. I mean, some of it is meant for the players to look at, and some of it's more for the DMs or somebody who's creating a setting. So I don't
and,
think while all the information is good for everybody, I think it's specialized and there's a good reason for it.
and in the case of something like Traveler, since day one, has had its core book split into three, with some rare exceptions that I don't want to get into the weeds about. It's usually been set up as one player facing book, one GM facing book, and one book dedicated to the setting, the Third Imperium. Since being a interstellar space opera, of course, it's not something that you can put in like a chapter. I mean, you
Yeah,
can. It's just not gonna.
yeah,
It's just not gonna work out all that well.
yeah. I imagine that would if they did it like that, that's more of a rough suggestion than an actual setting you can play with.
Hmm. But I've never been fond, and when it comes to that, I've never been fond of cases where people play half seas regarding whether or not a game has a setting.
Uh, like an optional setting for the game, but not necessary.
It's I've had cases where it'll say, oh, you can use this for all kinds of fantasy, and the way the game's fluff is written, the way the crunch is written, very clearly skews towards one subgenre of fantasy over others.
Yeah, I get you then.
It's like, for lack of a better term, shit or get off the pot. You can either be focused on a broad genre or a specific setting. You can't do both.
Yeah, I mean, unless you say go like GURPS and make a very flexible system that
Well,
was.
GURPS is a universalist game, and that is one angle, but that's an angle that has its own consequences that a lot of GURPS stands conveniently forget about when they keep telling me, "Oh, you can use GURPS to run anything." Yes, you
Mm,
can, but that's also like saying it's colder in January than it is in July.
yeah, oversimplification perhaps, or
Well,
but
the analogy I often use is it's like if your kid wanted a Disney princess doll for Christmas and you end up getting them a Princess Leia action figure. You're technically correct, but you kind of missed the point.
what are you talking about? Disney owns Star Wars now. No.
But so with Terra Incognita, um, before we even get into the crunchy end of things, you've described it as an adventure in Hollow Earth and a retro '80s fantasy. Now, saying that we're going 80s fantasy is still a very very wide net. So I'd like to ask about what sort of media were touchstones, major inspirations, that kind of thing, just to help narrow it down. What sort of 80s fantasy you're trying to shoot for?
Flash Gordon, for sure. That's a good mashup of fantasy and sci-fi.
And Queen.
Say, yeah, yeah. Ming the Merciless, right? That was a big one. Say Mike Grell's Warlord comic.
Hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
I am.
Again, Gartaris. That was a great setting. Anything Edgar Rice Burroughs, which again is not 80s, but
When you
there was a lot of Tarzan.
when you say Edgar Rice Burroughs, are we talking more Tarzan, or are we talking more John Carter?
That and maybe like Pellucidar and even some of like the Venus Chronicles or whatever too. Just all of it. I think he had a good tie-in sometimes with like these different races and cultures and technology, and we're kind of going back to that. We can throw in say 80s cartoons and stuff, the Hanna-Barbera stuff, say like Galtar, the Herculoids, any of that stuff.
Thundar the
Growing up,
Barbarian.
absolutely, yep, yep.
That's the
Um,
second time this week that I've referenced that's been referenced on one of these shows.
yeah, Thundar was actually there's a list of inspirations, and Thundar was in there.
Hmm. But it sounds
Just
like a
a
good
lot of
amount
stuff.
of it sounds like a good amount of what you're referencing for those touchstones is what's been referred to over the last few years as Sword and Planet.
Sword and Planet instead of Sword. Yeah, say Beastmaster. There's a lot of stuff. There was a lot of good 80s and 90s and even to an extent the 70s. There was that section when fantasy was not king but fairly mainstream for a while there, and then I think it got kind of corny, cheesy, and people stopped making it for a while. And then Lord of the Rings came back out again, and they're like, "Oh,
Um,
this is a viable
yeah,
market, right?"
yeah. Though I've something that I've longed for is the fantasy that doesn't take itself too seriously. Like a lot of people who are following in the path that the Lord of the Rings movies made did the serious fantasy, which certainly has its place, but
Mm.
I think just as important is the less serious side of things. Um, the like for example, a lot of the fantasy exploitation that came out of the 80s. One of the bigger ones for me was Conquest by Lucio Fulci, which is Conquest is weird. It's what happens when a guy who's known for his giallo films decides he wants to do a fantasy movie.
Mm.
And even to this day, I struggle to make heads or tails about some of it. Um,
I don't think I've ever seen that one. I just pulled it up on IMDb, and I don't know if it was
it was
just.
directed by Lucio Fulci, who has the nickname the Godfather of Gore,
Hmm.
and a lot. He, for the most part, he dealt with horror because he came out of that giallo movement that started in pulp novels, but but really ballooned into a kind of renaissance of it in like the 70s.
Mm.
Uh, the having him, and he certainly brought some of that aspect to it, but it's just kind of weird. Um, and the big the big thing when it comes to how I've always defined Sword and Planet is where you're dealing with one of those cases where it is doing fantasy, but it isn't trying to replicate some medieval point in history, but rather doing this kind of mishmash of different elements. And yeah, it could be argued that something like Thundar the Barbarian is a post-apocalyptic thing, which if we're going that far, then so is Conan.
Yeah.
But and of course the Hollow Earth thing, since you have that as the subtitle, is very much in keeping with the pulpy source materials. There's plenty of that whole there's an Earth inside the Earth that's the whole thing reversed.
Yeah, that was fun. Actually, I had to do some research about that. I think intuitively you kind of think that if you're inside the Earth, it'd be like being on the inside of a basketball and you're walking around kind of flip flopped the opposite direction of people on the surface because of the centripetal force, whatever throws you out towards the outer edge, but it doesn't work that way at all. So just looking at that and trying to figure out how it would work, and in terms of sources of light and things like that, because I mean you can't have complete darkness because you think, well, if it's completely hollow and you just walk around the inside of the shell, basically on the opposite, the flip side of the crust, then you can just have the core be a floating sun. But that doesn't work because you would actually fall toward it or be floating without any. It's weird. It's the way gravity works inside an object.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up going for just more of a layer of sorts. So it's more like an onion, and you're in the second layer, sort of like that. There's like a pocket there.
Yeah. Now, I think one of the things to really stand out is, even though this is using 5e's framework, a lot of the inner workings, especially on the player side, is significantly different than what someone
sure.
might expect with it. Even starting with just races, specifically the fact that you have a base AC set up and have hit dice for your different races within the setting.
Yeah. So we wanted to really play differently. I guess my opinion is that a lot of times in 5e, other than some of the role playing differences and the cultural differences with your different races, they for the most part they kind of play the same. They kind of Star Trek'd it and just slap on a different set of ears or something, or you're a little bit shorter or not, but they play effectively the same. And I think part of that's because they really didn't want to limit anybody. They want to make sure that any race was viable for any class, even though a lot of times it might not even make that much sense. I mean, the halfling barbarian, can you do it? Sure. Is it the best match? Probably not.
I've always looked at that as overcompensation. In 3E you had the +2 -2 thing, which then 5e decided to bring back, even though 4e didn't have it. And moreover, once you got past the first few levels, your race was irrelevant.
Sure. Maybe a different eyesight. You've got dark vision. I don't.
Yeah. I think at one point I ended up doing a. Does anybody here not have dark vision? Because it was like everybody has dark vision.
Yeah. Well, that's where you just throw out like a solar flare type effect, and then they're all blinded and disoriented for 1d4 rounds or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh.
But we wanted to play differently. So, yes, we have 12 races, and yes, there's 6 classes, and any of them could play any, but there's going to be some natural inclinations for once, like the Ursus that's in the sample. They're bareheaded men, very very greatly inspired by the 80s cartoons we've mentioned previously. Mm-hmm. But I mean, they're a giant barbarian with a bear head, basically. It's sort of like a minotaur, but with the head of a bear. They're brutal, they're strong, they're powerful. They're gonna lean toward that barbarian warrior type. Now, does that mean they couldn't be an explorer or an artisan and create things, or even a mystic, which is our game's caster class? They absolutely could, but the way that there's going to be so much better synergies between their traits and certain classes. So, I mean, just like certain people are born with artistic ability, so should they be a football player? Maybe if they want to, but it doesn't mean that their natural abilities lead that way, But we want it's all available. It's all possible. It's just some of them are going to be way better at certain things.
And
And I hope
if
that encourages a very mixed crowd when you're playing. Like you're going to have the one Ursus barbarian type guy, and then you're going to have the Scurius, which is like a large squirrel, and he's going to be the great rogue explorer class. And I really want the mix.
it also seems that you have that each has their own unique racial items and unique racial abilities.
Absolutely. So beyond just their appearance, every single ability. So we're doing it a little bit differently. There are not the same breakpoints as there are in 5e. The whole class race system's been overhauled. So the way it works, you start off level 1, you get 2 of your racial abilities, and up to 6 limitations or shortfalls that you have to grow past. Optionally, you can do 1d6 of them, or you can choose 1 or 2. It just depends. There's some shortfalls or limitations based on your race, and that's fine. It's part of the playing of the different race. So for Ursus, for example, they're limited on like the more mental side of things because they're supposed to be brutes, and so they might have a max intelligence of 10, and they might want to fight only with simple weapons. So they're not going to be carrying around a repeating crossbow or something. And they also have a disadvantage on charm and persuasion attempts. That's just not the kind of character they're going to be usually. So you can always play that one that doesn't fit your tribe because you're different. That's fun. But by and large, it's going to be the exception, not the rule. So starting at level 2, you get 2 of those traits, and the ones for that race are entirely different than the ones for every other race. So there's 15 of them. By the time you get to level 20, you'll probably have about 10 of them. So you can't get them all. So one of the reasons for this is that I want, when you're level 20 and there's somebody else plays the same race, same class, you're not going to be the same. And I don't mean just the numbers, but I mean the things that you chose. Did you lean more toward the pure martial damage side of things, or did you go more toward like a support slash heavy hitter that can protect and defend? So there's different options or kind of routes you could take. And then so every odd level you're going to get more racial traits. Every even level you're going to get class traits. So you don't actually even get a class until level 2. But I mean, you could always start at level 2. We also start you with more hit points than you're used to.
Which
And
I know some people will say that starting with more hit points is leaning too much into the whole superhero thing, but because there's a bunch of folk who have argued that 5e characters are too much like superheroes. To which I say, this has always been a power fantasy. So, what are you on? It has. I
to me,
find
it
it
was
kind of ridiculous.
survivability. I I think that the creatures we've created are brutal. I think that the abilities and the, especially if you end up going PvP at all, for whatever reason, that some of the abilities are extremely damaging, and you won't survive more than a couple hits. So you need that to start. Also, I think the power creep is very different in ours because yes, there's 15 options for the Ursus at level 1, but there's probably 5 of them that you're more likely to choose. And then a few of them are more like those fillers to round out your character as you get older. So other than hit points, I think our power level probably sort of plateaus a little bit faster, whereas I think with regular 5e, it's more exponential.
Um, there's some other problems within that. I just find the superhero argument a bit ridiculous. But when it comes to classes, I believe you have 6 that you're utilizing, and it's also in that it seems to be also in that similar kind of freeform approach where you're picking an ability from a pool, but not necessarily picking having set benefits at given levels.
Absolutely. So you're going to choose one and level even levels 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. You're always going to get something. There's never a level where you go up, you're like, well, I didn't get anything this round, or I only got to add hit points, and it's boring.
Hmm.
And it's not just to give you something, but I mean, it's a milestone. You've achieved something. So I want it to be valuable. But again, with the classes, you're going to have some options. In this case, you're going to have 18, not just 15 like at the race, but you're going to have 18 different options that you get to choose from. And each class sort of has its subclasses built in. For example, warriors, there's definitely more of the barbarian type character in there, or a regular fighter, and it, maybe a little bit paladin as well. So some of them are definitely different abilities you choose based on the character. And
Well, let's get into that.
mhm,
So, in the preview that you had sent me, there's six classes that are hinted at.
sure.
Um, I'd like to go into each and kind of get a feel for what their 5e equivalents would be in terms of classes, not necessarily subclasses, because in that regard we could be here all day.
Yeah.
Some, some, especially with some classes, subclasses, looking at you, every caster. Um, but we'll start with the one that's going to be obvious, and that's warriors.
Yep. Again, probably a mixture of barbarian paladin without the casting abilities, but like that more defensive fighter,
Hmm.
and just run of the mill fighter as well. It's mostly martial abilities. It pairs really well with more physical and impressive races.
Hmm.
So we've got like the Arborimics, which are giant plant men. We've got the the clickers, which are sort of like a mantis man, and they have the ability to molt and change their body. So pairing some of their multiple attacks with warrior abilities can be particularly nasty. You'll get that. I mean, because they have extra limbs, they're getting extra attacks from the get go. We tried to program in certain things. We weren't looking so much for perfect balance as much as like the intrigue of different playing styles. So, I mean, some of the smaller ones, for example, like the scurry is a little. I mean, how does a squirrel compare to a six-armed man-sized praying mantis that can tear you up? Well, they've got definitely the movement. They've got the ability to reincarnate to an extent. So, I mean, the, we're trying to come up with ways to make each race interesting.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't want any simple hobbits that people are like, why am I going to play that? I can play a human and get extra bonuses. You know.
And no,
So,
and certainly no equivalent of the basic fighter.
yeah.
Uh,
So yeah, I mean, warrior is the closest thing we have to a basic fighter in this case. So,
well, what
but
I mean by basic fighter is the fighter archetype who's just nothing but basic attack all day.
oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, we wanted some abilities. There's definitely ones to ignore armor and punch through, or skipping attacks to increase your armor class and such. So you can again defensive things or flurry of actions, that kind of stuff that we can do. Extra damage and critical hits. There's definitely some things in there, or also team buffs, so they could be that kind of leader that leads very paladin like, where they charge into battle and lead the crew, kind of pump them up.
Yeah. Next would be hunters.
Hunters were a ranged fighter, so somewhat basically a ranger, or but also mixing in things of say like 2E's rogue assassin class sort of.
Oh
So
yeah,
they are
the infamous assassin that was a bane of many designers' existence back in AD&D.
yeah, I guess. Definitely a lot of people want to do that, or ninja classes. I remember I had some friends who did that. Just gotta have a wakizashi, man. But yeah, they definitely have. They were kind of modeled somewhat like a Hawkeye, with they're supposed to have a little bit of trick shots or the ability to upgrade their weapons, extra range, and I mean, it's fairly obvious stuff, I think.
Hmm.
But also some survivability things a little bit.
Yeah. Uh, Next would be explorers.
Explorers were kind of an interesting and weird one to create. I guess the closest thing would be some of the rogues and bards. So they have definitely more movement upgrades, extra skills, extra charm stuff, but also some pretty quirky abilities where they can copy other effects that they've seen, non-magical effects. So they're a little bit copycat. A very jack of all trades kind of guy. Some really awesome attacks. Uh, I mean, there's some. It's a good mashup type character, and I think it plays well. I could definitely see a group having a warrior or a hunter, either or, as like your big damage guy, and then possibly an explorer or an artisan, which we're gonna get to in a second, as like a utility backup character. And then for a little bit heavier punch, you're probably gonna go mystic or stitcher as the more magical type.
Yeah, I can certainly get that.
So moving on to mystic then, eh?
Yep.
So mystic is the only true caster in the whole thing. So that one plays differently. So the way it's designed is that you choose a power set. So maybe it's fire, and you get 5 or 6 effects in there that work something like level 1 or 2 effects, and maybe some cantrips.
Hmm.
But they upgrade as you increase in power and as you go up levels. So there might be something like it does 1d6 fire damage for every 3 character levels or something like that.
Hmm.
So it'll upgrade at different breakpoints.
Yeah, and I'm
And
guessing that spells are just are just a different branch of, or what would be the equivalent of spells, are just a different branch of abilities. You're not doing the. It doesn't look like you're doing the spells per day kind of thing.
no, so the way we're doing them is we're doing them all on a recharge.
Hmm.
So when you first start, if you're untrained, you get one effect, and then you need to do a recharge of 10. So potentially you could do it 2 rounds in a row. But so the whole point would be then, as you go up in levels, when you get to spend another class trait, you can upgrade that. So then the recharge goes down to 8, and then you can have different effects in there. Eventually, it gets down to like a 6, and you can get a free cast without it costing anything, or you could store an effect depending on which way you're doing it. But there's a bunch of different power sets. There's 12 of them, so you can choose from, say, life or fire or light or air, and so I could definitely see people would probably get, say, maybe at level 2 they'll get one of them, level 4 they'll get another power set, and then maybe spend a couple slots to upgrade it so they're able to utilize them quicker. So it works a little bit like mana with a recharge to an extent.
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with that. I've made no bones about my criticisms of the spells per day model, also known as the Vancian model. Um, largely due to the fact that there's not really much of a in-universe justification for it, in my experience. I know why I know why it's there. It's because Gygax and Arneson were fans of Jack Vance's work, and he had the whole having to he had and the whole spells as artillery thing as a holdover from chainmail. But I've never seen a strong enough in-universe reason why, after casting that spell once, you can't cast it again until you rest for 8 hours. Like,
Yeah,
in the
I
books, there hasn't been a suitable explanation.
guess they do that a lot in fantasy novels where it takes a lot out of you.
Yeah, I can get the stamina thing, and stuff like Slayer's D20 or Shadowrun, that's the direction that they lean into, that you're taking fatigue damage when you're using magic. But the spell slot approach doesn't do that,
Mm.
or doesn't give a reason.
Yeah,
Just
it's not like it adds levels of exhaustion or anything. I guess there's a couple. What was it? You used to cast Restoration in 2D or second edition, and that would require a rest afterward, right?
yeah, Though I think at that point it's getting far into the weeds with it. Um, the the point is I the big reason in my opinion why that system is in there is a holdover from the days of chainmail,
Yeah.
which was more of a skirmish war game, which had magic as a kind of equivalent to artillery. Yeah.
So I mean, they did away with a lot of that in say fifth edition because they end up having cantrips all the time. I mean, so you definitely had things you could fire constantly, so you just don't have to use your dagger or your
Yeah, you still have that spell charge thing. So
yeah.
much so it's a case of sidestepping the problem, but still keeping the problem. Uh, or
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you have cantrips, which are the equivalent of the at will powers in the edition I'm supposed to hate, but I don't because I'm not getting paid. But which is one of those things I'm just supposed to conveniently forget about. But when it comes to the setup, is it fair of me to say that with mystics, you're picking a certain element to specialize, and that's what you're going with, or is it a case that your element determines your potential pool of spells? Period. Like if you're fire, you're not going to be switching other elements.
No, so each pool or each element is actually just one of the traits that you choose. So if you choose fire at level 2, you could also choose water at level 4, and you could choose air at level 6, and uh, entropy at level 8 if you want to. But there's other options that you're skipping then. Things that could like decrease your they could decrease your recharge time. They could increase the number of uses you get before you have to recharge. They could increase bonus damage. So I mean, there's definitely some other options, or limit your ability to store those charges in an item that you could share with somebody. Basically, creating wands. So I mean, there's definitely some options there. So I'm not limiting you to it. It fits in the setting because there's these deities in the setting that are based somewhat on different elements, and they're helping you. You basically have an affinity toward them, and it's sort of being granted to you as an ability that way.
hmm Which I'm perfectly fine with because customization is clearly the watchword for this game. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't a case like say base 5e where a lot of the subclasses there early on were built around the spheres, or that
Mhm.
whole you have to specialize in one sphere over the other when that doesn't really fit. But next would be artisans.
Artisans work like an artificer type engineer, a gadget maker, and crafter. Crafting is a huge part of the game. Every single creature stat block comes with a loot pile that is not gold and gems and magic items, but rather pieces you can hack off the body and use. It's very Monster Hunter in that way.
hmm
So when you defeat, say, like a giant dinosaur, you should be able to use their skin to make armor. You should be able to use their bones to make tools, their teeth to make weapons, and maybe they have some organs, a gallbladder or something that, or a poison gland that you can use to coat your weapons with. I mean, there'll be some weird creatures that maybe aren't that powerful, or maybe they're annoying to fight or find, but you're gonna hunt them down because of what they offer. Uh, so this setting doesn't have tons of other races that you're gonna hunt. It's not like the classic good guys versus bad guys where my elves and my dwarves are going to go hunt down the gnolls and the flins and the not the orcs and the goblins and all these other humanoid races to fight. You're fighting mostly beasts and a major evil source that we'll get into probably later as
hmm
which is a major plot point, but also each other. So you're fighting it because each race was designed to fit this special like niche, and they don't they don't often leave them, but there's some overlap there. So their territories kind of blend into each other, and they have some fighting there. But you're not going to see as many large kingdoms and stuff. It's more of like enclaves of different races, and sometimes they butt heads. But a lot of the time, it's surviving against nature, because nature is one of the major enemies here. There's natural disasters of magical and mundane sorts. There's creatures that are so large that you have to fight their body parts individually. I mean, you're like, so I mean, there are lots of terrible evils here, or not evils, but hazards and dangers and maladies, and that's probably why they haven't developed that kind of kingdom sort of culture, because it's just too brutal of a setting to be able to do that a lot of times.
Would you say that there's more city states than there are kingdoms?
Yeah, I don't really have any plans for any kingdoms for the most part. It's yeah, like enclaves and settlements and city states and stuff like that for sure.
Hmm. So the last one would be the Stitchers.
All right, that is probably somewhere between the mystic caster class and the artisan slash engineer type class. So the artisans are always one of the major parts of the setting is that there's these leftover pieces of technology that you can harvest from different ruins and use them to build technology. So you can have that flying sky sled like He-Man. So you can make like a laser cannon that with a recharge. All these a flying belt, so you can fly next to your buddies, the Volans flying folk, which are kind of like a bird people. So the Stitchers are kind of somewhere between them, because they can magically graft different body parts onto different creatures. Mm-hmm. So they have to, let's say you get a saber-tooth tiger, for example, or the setting equivalent of it. So you either train one or defeat one and like nurse it back to life or health, and convince it through a series of checks that it's going to be your pet slash familiar, and then you graft on some kraken legs, or tentacles. So you're depending on the size of the creature and your ability level, your training, you're able to put different parts on there. Or you kill a giant crab and you graft some of its armor onto your creature. So you're able to, in sort of like a ranger type way, you kind of Frankenstein together some beasts as a companion that has a multiple attacks and abilities of different creatures that you've hunted.
Mm-hmm. I can, and given all of that, when it crafting is one of those things that a lot of systems have attempted, and results over the years have been mixed. Is a generous way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with the crafting system that you're utilizing, what sort of angle are you taking in order to keep that emphasis on modularity that you've been using up until this point?
Well, we've tried to do racial, as you mentioned before, we did racial items. We wanted some things that fit for them for sure. We had some crafting stuff, so almost anybody can do at least the basics. For example, the Ursus, the big brutish barbarian type, they've got like a grizzly maul, an ancient fury axe, different things like that. We tried to have some that were armor or utility items, but definitely some weapons that fit that nature of the creature and where they live. But then there's some other options for the actual crafting. So going back to like the giant dinosaur, when you hunt them and get like that scaled armor or the scaled hide, a lot of them are going to have different like little tweaks on there, so it's not the same thing. I just can't kill any old dinosaur. Maybe this one, which has an acid breath weapon, when I take their hide, it's going to have, say, acid damage resistance and things like that. So we tried to make them different. Or this creature has very dense bones. So if we use its bones to craft any type of bludgeoning weapon, it does an extra 1d4 damage. Things like that. And or these teeth do an extra +1 piercing damage when used in a weapon. Minor tweaks that you could do, but things that you could definitely use to increase your creatures, your player, your character's effectiveness. And artisans play into that as well too, because they're able to take those items and even push them further. That's why I could definitely see, because the artisan doesn't sound like a great combat type character, but it's definitely a great one to have round out the party if you've got a fourth or so, because they can upgrade your weapons, upgrade your armor. They have bonuses on using the ancient technology and crafting new things out of there. So suddenly your Ursus barbarian warrior with a giant maul, now it does fire damage too. It's because your artisan upgraded it. So every time you're smashing it, it's like a perpetually on fire kind of ball of coal or heat. And so, I mean, doing things like that to add little tweaks. I want to add those +1s and +2s and extra 1d4 of damage, or an extra +1 armor class, or a damage reduction. Those sort of things. Not major, but a lot of it I think is going to depend on the DM and how they want to handle that. Because there's definitely some who are like, I'm not really feeling this crafting thing. Yeah, it's a +1 weapon now. Good, done. But I want the options in there.
Yeah. But with that said, since we're dealing with crafting, this is where I have to bring up the question of crafting one's own gear, and especially crafting like magic items. Because if we're dealing with a very sword and sorcery like setting, the idea of crafting one's own gear is going to be key to that, especially since you invoked Monster Hunter earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And well, crafting your gear is part of the loop with Monster Hunter. You go out, you kick ass, then you take loot from the ass that you kicked, use that to make better stuff, so kick more ass, and the cycle continues.
Yeah, and that was definitely an inspiration. That's why in the gear section we started with basic weapons, and it's up to your DM to an extent, but there are some crafting rules and stuff that are in there. So I mean, your 1d6 slashing hand axe. Well, you carefully crafted it out of this special volcanic obsidian you got. So now it's a +2, or some such. And then you also dipped it in the necrotic glands of this creature that you killed. So now for the next 4 attacks, it does an extra 1d4 necrotic damage, or things like that for sure. And a lot of those things might be temporary. So you have to keep redipping in poison or to get effects. So I could see you definitely doing a little bit of that grind to get some of the materials you want. And but I want people to be able to upgrade, and I think we've also thrown in enough nasty creatures that even if you upgrade a reasonably fair amount compared to like base equipment, I still think they're going to be challenging.
Mm-hmm. And that brings me to another thing. The monsters that I saw, aside from the fact that you have a bunch of different species representatives, you ended up using what appears, from my perspective, like a star rating system instead of using challenge rating.
CR to me, I don't know. I get it, and I know there's a mathematical formula, but it's not approachable, I don't think, for most people. And also, I don't know that it always was accurate depending on what kind of classes you're playing against that creature. So we went for a little more generic, and we went for basically a 5-star rating. And there are some charts in there. Like, for example, if you're able to pull up page 66 in the sample. It'll say 89 in the bottom because I pulled it out of another one. But for just for the sample itself, down at the lower right, we talk about creature threat levels. And so there's a star rating, very low or trivial, and low, moderate, severe, extreme, impossible, which is 6-star. We very rarely would use the 6-star one. But so it's basically 1 to 5 for 99% of cases. And they have a solo and a party rating. So for very low or trivial, basically, if you're solo at level 1 to 3, you can probably take it. Whereas if you're a party that's a party of 3, 4, 5, you're probably going to be able to take it at level 1. It shouldn't be much of a threat. So we tried to take the CR ratings and kind of condense them down because, I mean, in all honesty, what's the difference between a 1/8 and a quarter and a half? I don't know. It seemed like meaningless divisions. Even the difference between, say, a 2, 3, and 4. How really severe is that? Whereas a lot of times I felt like simplifying it to a 6-step threat level, and I think Pathfinder does similar.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe this might be a little more close to where they're at. So any 3-star one or a moderate difficulty should be fairly comparable, but there's also a little bit of swing there. So depending on your classes, it's just hard to judge. I mean, would you always assume there's a caster, a marshal, and a support, or would you? So we just tried to group them instead of trying to split strictly by CR. I find it a little more approachable and simplified.
I remember having issues with CR all the way back in 2000, and it's largely the same issue I have with it now. It operates on too many assumptions, or rather, it operates on some fatal assumptions. The big one is the assumption that the party is a balanced party of 4. Now, even if someone will argue that the party that they have for their campaign is a balanced party of 4, that's not an assumption that should be made.
Yeah. I mean, there's always that group that's 4 halfling bards that's just traveling together.
Yeah, it's a case where if it's gonna be meant as some sort of guidance, the least amount of assumptions should be used. It's like, are you familiar with Occam's razor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Easiest explanation.
Yeah, if I want to get pedantic, it's the explanation with the least amount of assumptions, but point still stands. The idea, the fact that is assumed for it is the issue that I have. Whereas a more broad star rating, if you're doing stars out of like 5, then that's going to be I think that's going to be a bit easier for people to work with without assuming that the party has to be kept matching up against monsters that match their CR, which is going to bottleneck your monster manual. For lack of a better term.
Yeah, I get it for sure. And it sounds like you're kind of on my side, so I really get it.
Yeah, I've had this attitude about CR for like 20 years. You know, and part of it was because of my frustration when the story would naturally indicate that a certain monster should show up in this part of the dungeon, but that's either too high or too low on the CR thing. So I have to use something that matches it, but doesn't match the story that I'm trying to tell at the table. I know some might say you shouldn't be trying to tell a story at the table. I'm like, cooperative storytelling is still storytelling, and a GM is as much of a director as he is a referee.
Yeah, for sure. And I think then there's going to be those that say, well, as a DM, you're just going to fluff the numbers.
Yeah.
Right? Like, well, if the 140 hit points is too much, and it's obviously too much, you should downgrade it and drop the AC on the fly, and just to keep the story going.
You may end up dropping it too much, and now you've got a weak sauce B-bag.
Yeah.
And the whole thing of the GM can be trusted to just fudge it. Um, a problem I've had a bit of a problem with that line of thinking, and I've described it like this: fudging, house ruling, what have you in those kind of situations should be a spice, not the main dish. And I don't know about you, but I don't put a whole container's worth of pepper on my steak.
No, I get you. But yeah, I try that. I try not to swing it too much. I mean, there's definitely cases where it's mid-session and it, a couple lucky rolls quickly change things. And you're like, whoa, not really aiming for a TPK here. So, but yeah, I've tweaked a few numbers here and there, but I usually try not to. But and not every battle is to the death either. Sometimes people got to run.
Hmm. Yeah, sometimes fit, sometimes metaphorically, and sometimes literally. Um,
Yeah,
or in my case, just have someone on the treadmill as a punishment for trying to cheat at the table. Few people cheat at my table because the punishment is worse than the crime. I'm not gonna put someone on like a treadmill for 5 minutes or something. No, it's gonna be 30 seconds, or have him on a high speed for like 5 seconds or something. Uh, and even then, I don't go that extreme. I usually just say, okay, you have to drink a bottle of bacon soda.
I think I've had that before.
Yeah, it's nasty. Uh, or when that one chip challenge was a thing, I was like, okay, you've got to eat one of these, and you're not
Yeah,
getting it. You're not getting any milk for about 5 minutes.
that's pretty brutal.
Well, that's the whole point. Make the punishment so much worse that nobody would want to press their luck. The expression "no one sword keeps another in the sheath."
Yep.
But I do think that kind of customization is um, important because when you look at various points of fiction, you're gonna find some type of weapon that's a bit unorthodox, or is not
Mhm.
what people would not what people would put in the standard weapon list. Just as an example, if I'm running a Fertile Crescent campaign, which would be more appropriate to equip a fighter with? A longsword or a khopesh?
The Kopesh.
Yeah. And I know some will make the argument of, well, just reskin the longsword if you want a khopesh. That's not satisfying. A longsword is likely going to be made out of steel. Khopesh is going to be made out of bronze. You're and it's going to be more like an axe than a sword, because you're not stabbing with a khopesh. It's just not built for that.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that's again, I think when that kind of customization is built into the crafting, it can make it fun. I mean, the
mhm.
Kopesh with the hook nature of it, you could probably use it for some sort of grappling or disarming type move, and that should be built in to make it more interesting.
One of my favorite examples of this sort of thing is the Polynesian Taiaha. It is about size-wise, it's akin to a short spear, but the back end that doesn't have the spear is flattened, so it can be used as a spear or as a club.
Mm.
And of course, there's also things like those Aztec weapons that I can never pronounce properly, Macahuitil. I will say it right one of these days. It is the club that has those obsidian shards in it.
That's kind of like the shark tooth one of the Polynesians, right? Where they
Hmm.
a Hawaiian shark tooth sword.
Yeah, it's just using shards of obsidian, and even though it's technically a club, you could take someone's head off with it. Now, granted, obsidian is very hard, but also very brittle, so it's not going to last long.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I would hope that people would craft and just say, "Hey, look, I found these teeth. I want to pound them into my club. Now, what's the damage?" And then the DM's going to rule on it. And I want that kind of crafting. So, or put some of those teeth on your armor, and then nobody's going to want to grapple with you because they're going to take 1d4 damage per round or something like
Or,
that.
I suppose another example of unorthodox would be, say, the twin hooks that are used by Shaolin monks.
Oh, the hook sword.
Yeah, where the hooks are able to be linked together, so you can do a wide swing with both.
Mhm.
Uh, you look through a bunch of different cultures. There's a bunch of those kind of setups, and just trying to reskin it into a long sword or an axe or what have you isn't going to feel satisfying to a player because it's a case of lipstick on a pig. No matter which lipstick you put on the pig, it's still a pig.
Yeah, for sure. I think it cuts down on just flavor. I mean, other than just a name on a paper, it should do something different.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you should have an entry for all of these different types. That'd be like Sisyphus pushing a boulder up a hill. But at the very least, an easy way to meet halfway is providing a means to make custom weapons, armor, and the like.
Yeah, after this discussion, I definitely want to review our crafting rules and make sure
Hmm.
they have definite options.
Yeah.
It's just such a wide variety of options that, I mean, you can make some general rules for the checks involved and the materials involved, but then a lot of it's going to fall on the DM to rule in a way that fits the game level. I mean, a level 15 character is not going to find it satisfying to, oh, I got another +1 on there. That's not great. You're looking for, you killed this epic creature. You want this weapon to do something a little more now.
Especially
But
since we have so. Stop me if you've heard this one in any mythology over the last 500 years. The hero takes out a monster and ends up using part of it as an upgrade for their equipment. If I have to use the most obvious example of this, Heracles against the Hydra.
yeah, the old Clash of Titans too, where they're using
Hmm.
the
Which,
Medusa head against the
yeah,
Kraken.
yeah. Although I still want someone to explain how the hell Medusa's blood makes scorpions.
It was mythology. It doesn't make sense.
I think a better argument is it was the '80s and somebody was
Yeah, yeah. It was still fun though, and it was one
yeah.
of the last great stop motion animation movies.
Although when it comes to Harryhausen's work, I am more fond of Jason and the Argonauts than I am Clash of the Titans. But that's a personal preference thing.
Yeah, I don't think I ever saw Jason the Argonauts more than once. Whereas for whatever reason, I think the channels we had as a kid, they played the Clash of the Titans. I think every summer. So
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But
The the of But with that said, as I understand it, you're doing 3 books for this project: a player's guidebook, a setting guidebook, and a campaign guidebook. Would
yep.
the campaign guidebook be the equivalent of a DM's guide?
No, it's strictly story for the most part. It adds some more background and lore. I guess there's no strict DM's guide because it's 5e compatible. I'm kind of assuming that you know how to play 5e, so I'm not just reproducing all their rules to fluff out page count.
Hmm.
Everything in here is like strictly new, and when I had to, I came up with new stuff to fill in gaps. But so I don't have rules on your checks and stuff like that. I'm just assuming and so this is not going to be a starter thing. It's for people who play 5e but want to reskin it in a new setting with new player or new player options for the most part. So the campaign guidebook strictly is story, and it's going to have the background lore on the evil in the setting and where that comes from. And it's also going to be a good tour of the world. I've got the map all worked out, so you should if you go through all 16 of the chapters, you will have hopefully saved the world and met all of the races and been in most of the different biomes and areas, and it should serve as a great introduction to the world, and then you can keep running with that on your own missions. I do have a second storyline planned, depending on sales and demand, but also, it could be a stretch goal as well. It just would not be ready as soon as the other ones. But I don't want to spoil too much about that. But yeah, I can talk about the main campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can go. I can get that. What would you be shooting for as far as page count for each book?
Right now, so the campaign still has some more writing to do. It's probably going to be close to 200. The setting guide is the largest one at this point because there's 100 different stat blocks for different creatures, 110-ish. Plus, this got like 100 plus different plants for the herbalism. It's got a lot of different artifacts and rules on creating different artifacts. It's very, again, modular is the thing for the system. So there's things where if I get this energy module plus this type of alloy and I mix it with this, I can create this. So there's these different recipes, I guess, or blueprints. So there's all that in there. There's just a lot of information in there. More stuff about the races and their settlements. So that one's 200 plus, and the character guide is about 160, 170 right now. And that's just races and classes and the abilities and custom sheets for the characters, because there's some slight changes here and there from the standard character sheet that you'd be used to.
Yeah. Now, with that said, I know that the Kickstarter isn't out yet. When do you plan on launching the crowdfund itself?
I'm hoping soon, like real soon. It'll be on a Tuesday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, coming soon. That's pretty specific, I guess, other than the date. So we're looking for 200 pre-sign-ups just to get us started. I want to make sure there's enough people following it. We've spent months on this. I think I launched the pre-sign-up first back in October. So we've been trying to collect names for a while, and we're trying a little bit of paid ads this time, but a lot of it's just word of mouth. So we appreciate word of mouth getting out anywhere. But we're hoping right now we're at 130, almost 140. So I only need about 60 more people to sign up, which is not undoable. It's definitely, I think, something we can achieve. I'm not going to hold out for say 500 or something. That would just take. I've got other ideas I want to explore too. I've done 5 or 6 different Kickstarters for 5e in the last couple years, and still got the ideas flowing. So I would really like to get this one out in people's hands and work on the next storyline or work on the next project. So I'm hoping by the end of summer for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now you're good. You're going to be going for 30 days, and I'm guessing you're shooting for at least for the PDF version that you'd like to have that delivered in late fall.
Yeah, we have a great track record of delivering. Mm-hmm. So in delivering quickly. So typically there's a lot of people that are putting a lot of finishing touches on, or maybe only are at the concept or early pre-writing phases. When I like pop it up on Kickstarter and actually launch, we're usually fairly close to done, and we're looking at polishing it, adding final touches, cleaning up any typos, and then adding whatever like stretch goal content needs to be added. So typically we have been doing them within about 2 months of wrap, because 2 weeks after they wrap, they send you payment, and then we order our dummy copies, our promo copies, and make sure they look good. And if they look good, then we start shipping. So I mean, sometimes we start shipping within a month, but I definitely within 2 to 3 months max of wrapping up, you should be getting stuff in your hands.
Mm-hmm.
And not all companies, but I would say very few can promise that and actually follow through.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the crazy that happens around here. And
No, thanks again for having me. And guys, if you're listening out there, we're always looking for play testers, extra writers, and creators. I work with a slew of people, and I'm always pulling in new, fresh faces. And I've had some great experiences working with a lot of different people and talking to a lot of different people. So don't hesitate to reach out. I usually respond pretty quick.
mm-hmm. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.